Picture this. It's October 15th, 1944. The rain hasn't stopped falling for 3 days straight, turning the battlefield into a muddy graveyard where hope goes to die. Lieutenant James Morrison crouches behind what used to be someone's home, now just a skeleton of broken walls and shattered dreams. The smell of gunpowder and death fills the air like a permanent fog that follows you everywhere. James is exhausted, not just tired from the fighting, but soul-deep exhausted. The kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong, about why men kill other men over lines drawn on maps by people who will never feel mud between their fingers or hear their best friend's last words. His platoon had been fighting for this small French village for 2 weeks. 2 weeks that felt like 2 lifetimes. They'd lost 8 good men taking it, and James carried their faces in his memory like photographs he couldn't put away. Tommy Martinez, who talked about his daughter's first steps. Private Collins, barely 19, who kept a lucky penny from his hometown carnival. Gone. All of them gone. But something strange happened that morning. As James picked his way through the rubble of what the locals called the old mapmaker's house, his boot caught on something that shouldn't have been there. Not a piece of debris or a broken tile, but something that felt different under his muddy soul. Something that made his spine tingle with an inexplicable chill. He knelt down and brushed away the concrete dust and broken glass. There, folded carefully and somehow completely untouched by the destruction around it, was a piece of parchment. Not ordinary paper, but real parchment, the kind that cost serious money and lasted for generations. His hands trembled as he unfolded it, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat like a trapped scream. It was a map, but not just any map. This was hand-drawn with incredible detail, showing terrain that looked familiar, but somehow wrong at the same time. The strange thing was, it showed their current position with pinpoint accuracy. Every destroyed building, every crater, every trench line was marked with surgical precision. But how was that possible? This village had been bombed just days ago, and this parchment looked ancient, like it had been drawn by someone's grandfather. James studied the map closer, his heart beginning to race. The markings weren't in any language he recognized, but somehow they made sense to him, like his brain was translating them without his permission. There were arrows showing troop movements, X marks indicating supply drops, and most disturbing of all, small skulls marking what could only be casualties. The skulls were positioned exactly where his men had fallen. His hand started shaking so violently he almost dropped the map. This was impossible, completely, utterly impossible. Yet here it was, spread out in his trembling fingers, showing things that hadn't happened when it was supposedly created, things that cost him friends and sleepless nights and pieces of his soul he'd never get back. As James stared at the mysterious parchment, something else caught his attention. The map didn't just show what had already happened, it showed more. Areas they hadn't fought over yet, positions they hadn't taken, battles that, according to this impossible document, were still waiting for them in the days ahead. And in the corner, written in faded ink that looked centuries old, were 3 words that made his blood run cold. For James Morrison. The rain kept falling, drumming against the broken walls around him like a funeral march. But James Morrison no longer felt the cold or heard the distant artillery. All he could think about was the map in his hands and the terrible question that was eating away at his sanity. How does a map show the future, and why was it meant for him? James couldn't sleep that night. Not that sleep came easy in a war zone anyway, but this was different. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those strange symbols on the map dancing behind his eyelids like some kind of fever dream that refused to break. He'd hidden the parchment inside his jacket, pressed against his chest, where he could feel it with every heartbeat, every breath reminding him that he was carrying something that shouldn't exist. By dawn, exhaustion had carved deep lines into his face, making him look older than his 26 years. His sergeant, Bill Hawkins, noticed immediately. "Morrison, you look like death warmed over. What's eating at you?" Bill's voice carried that gruff concern that only came from watching too many young officers crack under pressure. James hesitated. "How do you tell someone you found a map that predicts death? How do you explain that every instinct screaming in your head says this thing is real, even though reality says it's impossible?" But looking at Bill's weathered face, seeing the genuine worry there, James made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out the map. He studied it for a long moment, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion to something that looked like fear. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Found it in the rubble yesterday. Bill, look at these marks here. This one's where Tommy died. This one's Collins. This one's Henderson." His finger traced across the parchment, and with each name, Bill's face grew paler. "That's impossible, Lieutenant. This paper looks ancient." "I know it's impossible. But look at this." He showed him the sections that depicted future movements. "According to this map, we're supposed to advance toward Hill 237 tomorrow, but headquarters hasn't even briefed us on that yet." Bill ran his calloused fingers over the strange symbols, and something remarkable happened. Just like with James, the meaning seemed to flow into his mind without explanation. Supply routes appeared as dotted lines. Enemy positions showed up as dark triangles. Weather patterns were indicated by swirling marks that somehow communicated rain, wind, even the exact times of day. "Lieutenant, this is either the most elaborate hoax I've ever seen, or—" Bill's voice trailed off because finishing that sentence meant acknowledging something that rational men weren't supposed to believe. "Or we're holding something that knows things it shouldn't know." James completed the thought. They spent the next hour studying every detail. The map was incredibly comprehensive, showing not just troop movements, but also the emotional states of soldiers through color-coded systems. Red areas indicated high stress and likely casualties. Blue zones showed where men would find brief moments of peace or unexpected friendships. Yellow marked places where crucial decisions would be made. What disturbed them most was how personal it all seemed. The map didn't just show James's unit, it showed James himself, a small figure that moved across the parchment, leaving traces of his journey like breadcrumbs in a dark forest. And wherever this figure went, the outcomes seemed to shift and change, as if his presence was somehow connected to everything that happened. "Look at this," Bill pointed to a series of interconnected lines that seemed to follow James's movements. "It's like you're the center of it all, like everything revolves around the decisions you make." James felt a chill run down his spine. The responsibility was crushing. If this map was real, if it truly showed the future, then every choice he made could mean life or death for his men. No pressure, just the weight of destiny sitting on his shoulders like a mountain he never asked to carry. But there was something else. Hidden in the corner, almost too faint to see, was a date written in that same ancient-looking ink. November 3rd, 1944. Just 3 weeks away, and next to it, a symbol they hadn't seen anywhere else on the map. A symbol that looked disturbingly like an ending. The question that haunted both men was simple and terrifying. What happens on November 3rd? And were they brave enough to find out?
3 days later, the impossible became undeniable. James sat in the command tent, listening to Colonel Richards brief them on their next objective, and every word that came out of the colonel's mouth matched exactly what the map had shown them. Hill 237, dawn assault, flanking maneuver from the east. Even the weather forecast matched the swirling symbols they'd deciphered. James caught Bill's eye across the tent. The sergeant's face was stone, but James could see the storm brewing behind those steady eyes. They both knew what this meant. The map wasn't just accurate about the past, it was actually predicting the future. And if it was right about Hill 237, then it was probably right about everything else, including those skull marks that indicated where men would die. As the other officers filed out to prepare their units, James lingered behind. His hands were sweating despite the October chill, and his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He had a choice to make, and it was tearing him apart. The map showed that if they followed the original battle plan, they would take Hill 237, but at a cost. Private Jenkins would step on a mine near the north slope. Corporal Murphy would take a sniper's bullet just before reaching the summit. Young Williams, who'd just gotten a letter from his sweetheart back home, wouldn't make it past the first defensive line. But the map also showed alternative routes, paths that weren't in the official plan, marked in a different shade of ink that seemed to pulse with possibility. If James could convince his men to deviate slightly, if he could guide them along these hidden routes without revealing his impossible source of information, maybe he could save them. The assault began at 0600 hours, just as the map predicted. James led his platoon up the muddy slopes of Hill 237, his heart pounding with each step. When they reached the spot where the map showed Jenkins would trigger the mine, James called for a halt. "Something doesn't feel right," he announced to his men, scanning the area with manufactured concern. "We're going around the long way." Jenkins looked confused. "But Lieutenant, the direct route would save us 20 minutes. "Trust me on this one, Jenkins." James's voice carried an authority that came from knowing things he couldn't explain. They took the longer route, and 20 minutes later, they heard the explosion from the original path. A German patrol had triggered the very mine that would have claimed Jenkins' life. The young soldier's face went white. "How did you know, sir?" He couldn't answer that question without sounding insane, so he just kept moving. But inside, something was shifting. The map was real. It was actually real, and he could use it to save his men. The next test came at the midpoint of their advance. According to the original plan, they should have pushed straight up the eastern face, but James knew what waited there. A sniper's nest, positioned exactly where Corporal Murphy would be most vulnerable. So he made another tactical decision. "Murphy, take your squad and circle wide to the west. Something tells me we'll have better cover that way." Murphy nodded without question. He trusted his lieutenant's instincts, never knowing that those instincts came from a piece of impossible parchment hidden in James's jacket. When they finally reached the summit of Hill 237, James did a quick head count. Everyone was accounted for. Everyone was alive. For the first time since finding the map, he allowed himself to breathe. But as the adrenaline faded and reality set in, a new fear took its place. If he could change the outcomes shown on the map, what else might change? Were there consequences to altering destiny? And most terrifying of all, what if saving these men somehow made November 3rd worse? Bill approached him as they secured their position. "Nice work today, Lieutenant, though I'm curious how you developed such good instincts for avoiding trouble." James looked at his sergeant, this man who'd become his partner in carrying an impossible secret. "Maybe some troubles are worth avoiding," he said quietly. But deep down, James wondered if he was saving his men or simply delaying their fate, and time was running out to find the answer. Over the next 2 weeks, James Morrison became known as the Lieutenant with Impossible Luck. His unit hadn't lost a single man since Hill 237, while other platoons continued to bleed into the muddy French countryside. Word spread through the ranks about Morrison's uncanny ability to sense danger, to find the safest routes, to always know exactly when to move and when to wait. But James knew the truth was far more terrifying than luck. Every morning, he would unfold the mysterious map in the pre-dawn darkness, studying it like a priest reading sacred scripture. And every morning, the map showed him new horrors that would unfold if he didn't intervene. The strangest part was how the map seemed to be changing. Not the basic geography or the major battle lines, but the smaller details, the paths James chose, the lives he saved. These alterations rippled across the parchment like stones thrown into a still pond. New routes would appear overnight, marked in that same ethereal ink. Alternative outcomes would materialize, giving him more choices, more opportunities to cheat death. It was as if the map was learning from his decisions, adapting to his attempts to change fate. Lieutenant, Private Williams approached him one evening as they made camp near a bombed-out church. The same Williams who should have died on Hill 237, but was now alive because of a
route that existed only on an impossible map. "The men are starting to talk, sir. They're saying you've got some kind of sixth sense." James looked up from cleaning his rifle, his stomach nodding. "What kind of talk?" "Good talk, sir. They trust you. More than trust, actually. They believe in you. Henderson said yesterday that he'd follow you through hell itself because somehow you always know the way." The weight of that faith was crushing. These men believed in him, but James knew he was just following instructions from a piece of parchment that shouldn't exist. What would they think if they knew their survival depended on something that defied every law of reality? That night, as James studied the map by candlelight, Bill joined him in the ruins of what used to be someone's kitchen. The sergeant had become his closest confidant in this impossible situation, the only other person who knew the truth about their miraculous survival rate. "Show me tomorrow," Bill said quietly. James pointed to the section of map that revealed their next 24 hours. According to the parchment, they would encounter a German patrol at 1400 hours near a destroyed farmhouse. 3 enemy soldiers would be positioned behind what looked like debris, but was actually a carefully constructed ambush. The map even showed their exact positions, down to which one would be smoking a cigarette and which one would be reloading his weapon. "If we stick to the original reconnaissance route, Johnson and Martinez walk right into it," James explained, his voice heavy with the knowledge of deaths that hadn't happened yet. "But look here," he traced a line that curved around the danger zone. "This path keeps us downwind and out of sight. We can observe their position without being detected." Bill stared at the markings, still struggling to accept what his eyes were showing him. "James, I have to ask something that's been eating at me. What if this map isn't trying to help us? What if it's testing us somehow?" The question hit James like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on saving his men that he hadn't considered the possibility that he was part of some larger game. But now that Bill had voiced the fear, James couldn't ignore the evidence. Every time he changed something, the map revealed new information. Every life he saved seemed to unlock more of its secrets. "What do you mean?" Bill leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What if November 3rd isn't just a date on this thing? What if it's the whole point? What if everything we're doing, every change we're making, is leading up to something we can't see yet?" James felt ice water in his veins, because as much as he hated to admit it, Bill might be right. The map had never shown them what happens on November 3rd, only that something significant will occur, something that requires James to be in a specific place with specific people, having made specific choices. "Then we're not saving anyone," James whispered back. "We're just rearranging who dies when." Outside their makeshift shelter, the wind picked up, howling through the broken walls like voices of all the men who had died in this war. And somewhere in that haunting sound, James could swear he heard something that chilled him to his core. The sound of time itself, counting down to November 3rd. The map might be keeping their men alive today, but what price would they all pay tomorrow?
November 2nd, 1944. 24 hours before the date that haunted James Morrison's dreams, the morning came gray and bitter, with frost covering the ground like a shroud over the French countryside. James hadn't slept in 3 days, unable to close his eyes without seeing that mysterious November 3rd symbol burning behind his eyelids like a brand. The map had been changing more dramatically over the past week. New sections appeared overnight, showing terrain they hadn't even reached yet. But most disturbing of all, the area around November 3rd remained blank except for that single ominous symbol. It was as if the map refused to reveal what waited for them at the end of this impossible journey. James spread the parchment across a makeshift table in their command post, a shell-damaged barn that smelled of old hay and gunpowder. His hands trembled as he studied the latest editions. The map now showed showed their current position with perfect accuracy, down to the number of men in his unit and their exact formation. But more than that, it showed something that made his blood run cold. They weren't alone. Another figure appeared on the map, moving parallel to their position. Someone was tracking them, staying just out of sight, but matching their every movement. The figure was marked with a symbol James had never seen before, one that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. "Bill, look at this." James's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. The sergeant studied the new markings, his weathered face growing pale. "Who is that? German patrol? I don't think so." James traced the mysterious figure's path. "Look at the route they're taking. They know exactly where we're going. They've been following us for days, maybe weeks. And look at this." James pointed to a convergence point on the map, where their path and the stranger's path came together. November 3rd. The location where everything would finally make sense, or where everything would end. As if summoned by their discovery, a voice called out from the morning mist, "Lieutenant Morrison, I believe it's time we met." James's heart stopped. The voice was speaking English, but with an accent he couldn't place. Not German, not French. Something older, more timeless. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for Bill to circle around while he approached the voice. From the fog stepped a figure that defied every expectation. An elderly man, maybe 70, wearing clothes that seemed to belong to no particular army or time period. His eyes held the weight of centuries, and in his hands he carried something that made James's world tilt on his axis. Another map, identical to his own. "You've been following my breadcrumbs quite well, Lieutenant, though I suspect you've begun to realize this isn't a game you can win." "Who are you?" James demanded, his rifle trained on the old man's chest. "My name is Henri Dubois, and 43 years ago I stood exactly where you are standing now, holding the same map you carry, trying to save the same kinds of men during what you now call the Great War. I thought I was so clever, changing fate, saving lives, just like you." James felt the world spinning around him. "That's impossible." "Is it? You've been carrying impossibility in your jacket for weeks." Henri stepped closer, seemingly unconcerned about the rifle pointed at him. "The map appears to those who care too much, Lieutenant. To officers who would give anything to bring their men home alive. It offers power over fate itself, but it never tells you the cost." "What cost?" James's voice was barely a whisper. Henri's eyes filled with tears that looked like they'd been waiting 40 years to fall. "The cost is that someone else must pay the price you refuse to accept. Every life you save in one place creates a debt that must be paid in another. Every change you make ripples forward through time, demanding balance." The old man pulled out his own map and showed James a section marked with familiar symbols. "November 3rd, 1944, the day my debts come due, the day all the lives I saved 40 years ago must be balanced by lives lost today. And you, Lieutenant Morrison, are the instrument of that balance." James staggered backward, the truth hitting him like artillery fire. No, that's not. I saved my men. I kept them alive." "Yes, you did, just as I saved mine. But the universe keeps its own accounting, and tomorrow the books must be balanced." The old man's voice was gentle, but implacable. "You've been gathering the men who were meant to survive, collecting them like pieces on a chessboard. Tomorrow they will face a battle that was always meant to happen, carrying the weight of every life that should have been lost along the way." James looked down at his map, and for the first time he could see it clearly. Every change he had made, every life he had saved, every route he had chosen had been leading to this moment. He hadn't been saving anyone. He had been collecting them for November 3rd. The map had never been showing him how to cheat death. It had been showing him how to deliver it more efficiently. And now there was less than 24 hours to figure out how to break a cycle that had been 40 years in the making.
November 3rd, 1944. Dawn came like a funeral march, gray and cold and final. James Morrison sat in the ruins of that same mapmaker's house where this nightmare had begun, staring at the parchment that had consumed his soul. But now he wasn't alone. Henri Dubois sat across from him, two men separated by 40 years, but bound by the same terrible burden. "There's something you need to understand about the map," Henri said quietly, his ancient hands trembling as he spoke. "It doesn't predict the future, Lieutenant. It creates it. Every mark, every symbol, every route it shows you becomes reality the moment you accept it as truth." James looked up, his eyes red from sleepless nights and tears he'd finally allowed himself to shed. "Then why show it to us at all? Why torture us with choices if we're just puppets?" Henry smiled sadly. "Because it's not about the map, my boy. It never was. The map is just parchment and ink. The real power, the real curse, comes from something much simpler and more human." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Love." "Love?" "The love you feel for your men, the desperate need to bring them home alive. That love creates a resonance, a connection that transcends time itself. The map appears to those whose love is so strong it literally reshapes reality around them." Henri's voice cracked with emotion. "But love without wisdom becomes obsession, and obsession always demands a price." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching engines filled the air. German tanks, exactly where the map had predicted they would be. James's men were already in position, following the battle plan that had been written in that mysterious ink weeks ago. But James wasn't moving toward his position. Instead, he was doing something that had never appeared on any version of the map. He was walking away. "Where are you going?" Henri called after him. "To break the cycle," James replied, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. "You said the map creates reality when we accept it as truth. Then what happens if we refuse to accept it?" James pulled out the parchment, and with hands that had trembled for so long they'd forgotten how to be still, he began to tear it apart. The ancient material resisted at first, as if it had a will of its own. But James persisted. Each tear sent ripples of energy through the air, like reality itself was being rewritten. "No!" Henri screamed, rising to his feet. "You don't understand. If you destroy the map now, all the changes we've made will collapse back on themselves. Everyone we saved will die anyway, all at once." James paused, pieces of the map scattered at his feet like the dreams of dead men. "Then that's a price I'll pay, because living as a puppet of fate isn't living at all." But as the last piece of the map fluttered to the ground, something extraordinary happened. The sounds of battle that had been approaching suddenly stopped. The engines went silent. Even the wind held its breath. And then James understood. The map hadn't been controlling them. They had been controlling the map. Every decision made in love, every choice driven by the desperate need to protect others, had been feeding power into that piece of parchment. The map was nothing more than a mirror, reflecting back their own will to change the unchangeable. Henri looked around in amazement as the silence stretched on. "The battle, it's not happening because we're not fighting it," James realized. "The map only had power because we gave it power. The moment we stopped believing in predetermined fate, fate stopped being predetermined." In the distance, James could see his men emerging from their positions, confused but alive. The German tanks that should have been rolling toward them were nowhere to be found, as if they had never existed outside the imagination of a piece of magical parchment. Henri began to weep, 40 years of guilt and anguish finally finding release. "My men, the ones I lost, were never really lost. They were just waiting for someone to realize that love doesn't create debt. Love creates possibility." As the sun sun finally broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the French countryside, James Morrison understood what the map really was. It wasn't a tool of fate or destiny or cosmic balance. It was a test of faith. Faith in love over fear, hope over despair, choice over predetermination. And sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go. The war would end eventually, as all wars do. Men would go home to their families, carrying stories they could never fully explain. And somewhere in the ruins of a mapmaker's house, pieces of impossible parchment would turn to dust, their purpose finally fulfilled. Because the map that shouldn't exist taught them the most important lesson of all. The future isn't written in ink and parchment. It's written in the choices we make when we refuse to accept that love isn't powerful enough to change the world.